All right, so today we're going to dive into a really controversial and honestly pretty complex interpretation of one of the biggest shows on the planet, Stranger Things. It's a theory that argues the story we see on screen is revealing a pretty disturbing truth, one its creators might never have intended, and it all centers on one of the show's most beloved characters. So this is where it all blew up. This tweet from commentator Jack Posobiec is, well, it's blunt and it's shocking. For a lot of fans, this was an unthinkable way to look at the show. But for others, it felt like someone was finally saying an uncomfortable, unspoken truth out loud. Either way, a statement this strong forces you to take a closer look at what the show is actually showing us. So, the big question is this just some fringe theory from the internet, or does it actually point to a structural truth baked into the show's DNA? The argument isn't just that a monster was scary, it's that the moment Vecna first connects with young Will Byers, well, it functions as a symbolic grooming event, and that the entire narrative from that point on directly links this trauma to Will's journey with his sexuality.
Okay, so before we go any further down that rabbit hole, we have to look at the official story, right? What did the show's creators, the Duffer Brothers, actually say they were trying to do with Will's character?
So, the Duffer Brothers have been really clear about this in interviews. They say Will's identity as a gay character is something he's always had, right from their very first pitch. And his journey is meant to be one of empowerment, where embracing his true, authentic self is what gives him the power to fight back against this monster who's preying on his deepest fears and shames. And this is really the key point from the showrunner's perspective. The idea is that, yeah, the trauma Will goes through definitely makes his fears and his sense of being an outsider worse, but it doesn't create who he is. That was always there. The plot is supposed to be about him finding the courage to own it. And this right here is the core of this whole analysis. It gets at this fascinating gap between what a writer intends to say and what the story they've built actually shows us when we watch it on screen. Because a lot of people feel like there's a huge disconnect. Now, the main defense you hear against this controversial interpretation is that the scene is just body horror. You know, a classic genre trope. But the analysis we're looking at argues that this defense completely misunderstands what body horror is really all about. See, body horror isn't just about being gross or jump scares. The whole genre is built on the terror of violation. It taps into our deepest anxieties about having something foreign put inside of us, something that changes who we are from the inside out. And more often than not, it comes with some seriously heavy sexual and psychological undertones.
And this is where it gets really interesting. On one side, you have the creators saying the scene is just body horror. And they even point to a classic example, the movie Alien. But the critique says that bringing up Alien doesn't help their case at all. In fact, it actually proves the opposite point.
I mean, listen to this quote. The screenwriter of Alien, Dan O'Bannon, was not subtle about this. He was completely explicit. He didn't see the face-hugger scene as some neutral horror moment. He literally described it as a metaphor for sexual violence, designed specifically to make male audiences feel violated. And it wasn't just the writer either. The artist, H.R. Giger, who designed the creature, drenched his work in sexual imagery. So when the creators of Stranger Things say their scene is just like Alien, they are, maybe without even realizing it, reinforcing the interpretation of sexualized violation, not running away from it. This brings us to a really core psychological argument in this analysis, the idea that the show's story takes two very different kinds of shame and basically treats them like they're the same thing. On one hand, you've got orientation shame. That's the understandable fear of what could happen if you come out in a less than accepting world. But on the other hand, you have something much darker and way more complex, abuse response shame. This is the kind of shame that comes from the violation itself, a shame that real-world survivors often say is all tangled up with confusion, self-blame, and even the fear that some part of them was responsible. So the critical point of this analysis is that the show collapses these two things. It presents Will's coming out not just as a way to conquer his fear of rejection, but as the master key that magically breaks the psychic bond that was forged with his abuser. And this narrative choice gets even more loaded when you look at this real-world data. Studies consistently show that LGBTQ adults report having experienced childhood sexual abuse at rates 3 to 4 times higher than heterosexual adults. So the story, whether it meant to or not, is tapping into a very real and very painful statistical reality. So what's the big deal? What's the massive problem with fusing these two different kinds of shame and then offering this one simple solution?
Well, the analysis argues that it creates a deeply problematic implication that has some pretty significant real-world consequences for how we talk about trauma and identity.
And that brings us to the final, powerful conclusion of this whole analysis, what the source material calls an unconscious revelation. Look, the Duffer Brothers can say that Will was written as gay from the very beginning. And that's true. It's their story. But that's an authorial position. It's a statement about their plan for the character. It doesn't change how the plot itself actually works on screen and what that plot structurally communicates to us, the audience.
And this is the core revelation of the analysis. Within the plot that was actually written, the predatory violation is the one event that gives the gay empowerment arc its meaning. Think about it. Without the trauma bond that Vecna created, there's no narrative reason for Will's coming out to be the specific key that defeats him.
When you put the stated intent right next to the actual narrative, the contradiction is pretty stark. The intent was a story about overcoming homophobia. The on-screen result, though, is a story where resolving a trauma bond from a predator requires embracing an identity that is, narratively, tied directly to that very trauma.
So, the ultimate conclusion of this analysis is that the story isn't actually about overcoming homophobia at all. Instead, it's a story that structurally fuses predatory trauma with the origin and expression of a character's queer identity. In effect, it's telling the absolute opposite story that the showrunners say they wanted to tell.
And this leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question. What does it mean for us, as an audience, when a story, through its very structure, tells a powerful and uncomfortable truth that its own creators either don't see or just won't admit?